And hi everyone, I'm Emily Birch, the founder of WildSight, and as Paige mentions, we help companies make sense of nature and move to action. And so far we've been focusing on learning tools like bite-sized video series on things like naturetech, policies and frameworks, and investing in nature. And now we are expanding into practical tools that can support business action. So things like getting compliant with reporting frameworks and setting high-level strategy and targets. And a little bit on me and my journey. So like some of you, I'm a lifelong nature nerd, and I've spent my career at the intersection of business, tech, and nature, the three things that I love, and conveniently, the three things that come together to drive real change. So I started out advising execs and policymakers on sustainability at McKinsey and got deep into carbon markets and nature-based solutions. This led to a bunch of really interesting opportunities, including this thing called the Leaf Coalition, working to scale forest protection in a big public-private partnership. But the deeper I got, the more I wanted to get close to the ground. So to actually understand what was going on and happening and how it all worked. And I also wanted to address the supply challenge of scaling nature-based solutions. So I joined the naturetech startup, Revalue, moved to Indonesia, which is where I am now. And I spent the last 3 years or so working on designing the next gen of high integrity nature projects. But the common thread through all of this is I'm super interested and passionate about the massive potential that businesses have to drive action for nature, but also the massive barriers. So what's holding them up? And that's what pushed me to leave Revalue to focus on. And so WildSight, the company that I recently founded, exists to make it radically easier for companies to get their foot in the door and to act on nature in a really practical and simple way. So a nature positive future is one where we stop harm to nature and then actively restore it on a planetary scale. So it's not some idealistic dream state, but it's an existential imperative. And this audience, you guys will be familiar with the numbers, right? What they all point to is nature is really in crisis and our economies and lives are entirely dependent on it. And so the scale and rate of change required to reach a nature positive future is immense. We're talking about things like ending deforestation, redirecting trillions of dollars of investment from harmful activities, and restoring millions of hectares of degraded land. And so to achieve this, at the core of a nature positive future is this fundamental rethink of how we integrate the value of nature into our economic systems and decision making. So everything from like how we invest, how we design cities, how we grow food, how we run businesses, like the list goes on. And we can take the example of Costa Rica to bring this concept of integrating the value of nature to decisions to life. And this is what the nature positive future is all about. So with Costa Rica, they needed to expand their power system, which in the past has relied on hydropower, a renewable source, but one that comes with trade-offs, right? So large dams can damage river ecosystems, displace communities, and disrupt water supplies locally. And so instead of building more dams, Costa Rica took all of this into their consideration, into their decision-making process, and made a different choice. So they committed to expanding wind, solar, and geothermal energy instead. And so this approach, it meets growing energy demand, right? But without the environmental costs that they were facing with hydropower. So it's just one small example. I'm sure we'll touch on a few more as we go through. But I think it brings to life that the nature positive future, it's about stopping harm and then reversing it. And the way we get there is by integrating the value of nature into decision making. There are a lot of different things going on, but to massively simplify, there are two dynamics driving it. One, the nature crisis is becoming an economic crisis in real time. So this gets at a lot of the risks language you might be familiar with. And this is getting at things like invasive species destroying billions of dollars worth of crops. So there's this risk element, and it's very real, and it's happening now. And then the other thing that's happening in tandem is the private sector is starting to see that nature positive isn't just about risk, but about possibility. So, for example, new revenue opportunities. There's a well-known example with Unilever that diversified to a plant-based offering, and it's generated over $1.5 billion in annual sales. Other opportunities like price premiums that customers are willing to pay for nature positive products, as well as things like brand loyalty. So this is the opportunities language that you might have heard. And at the same time, there's a bunch of other great stuff that's happening and building up traction. So we're seeing institutions and organizations getting behind this. And to call out just a few, we've got the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, bit of a mouthful, the TNFD, which is guiding businesses on disclosing these risks and opportunities, and also the Science-Based Targets Network, which is helping develop a methodology to help companies set targets for nature. So these two big risk and opportunity dynamics are at the core. I like to think of them as the real thing driving. And then on top of this, there is this evolving nature market ecosystem. I'd again come back to these two buckets of risks and opportunities, and this is the real why it's so relevant for businesses. And to elaborate a bit on the risks, businesses are coming up against things like supply chain disruption, price volatility, reputational damage, regulatory pressure, stranded assets. These are all quite big, scary terms, but there's a bunch of very real impacts today. So Nestle has faced a 4% decline in stock price, getting called out for sourcing palm oil from deforested areas. Another mining company's stock fell nearly 20% following regulatory changes, so there's transition risk. So while these risks are very real, on the other side, and sometimes the side that's not talked about enough, is the opportunities. And so this is really why it's important for businesses to get their hands around this issue now. But the question isn't if we extract, it's just how to make that extraction regenerative rather than destructive. And I think you're right in saying that how does that work if we're still operating in the current system of economic incentives, and how financial value is measured, which excludes anything to do with are you harming the orchards that you're working on, or whatever it might be. And so the twist or the challenge is like, how do we apply the value of nature into that existing economic incentive system? So what would it look like if you put all of your assets of a big pharma company on the balance sheet, and you actually had to financially put a value on the land you're extracting, like the risks associated with it, and then also consider the other side. I know you said that you didn't want to think about premiums, and maybe that's for like more of a philosophical thing, but how can you start seeing those financial opportunities with more regenerative models? So you might be able to open the copper mine, for example, but instead of it being the traditional super extractive, super destructive, there's a lot of degradation that is left behind from that mine. How could you open, run it, and close it in a much more like nature positive way? So I think of these things is like there are all of these decisions and trade-offs, and what different regions or countries prioritize will depend, as you say, on their economic and political situations. But I think the challenge to move towards is, how do you make them less mutually exclusive, as you put it? Like, how can you make these business models or these decisions competitive with the traditional extractive ones.